Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to that meeting earlier today. It's good to hear you all chat, get a little bit of normalcy into our online life here. But like I said, I'll keep posting these check-in videos with some basics from each chapter, continuing today with some behavioral aspects related to working memory. So, like I said, I think this chapter is really exciting. It's some of the more fun stuff to study, I think, in learning and memory if you're interested really in cognitive behaviors of humans. This capacity underlies a lot of the more interesting things that we're able to do, and there's really clear relations to behaviors that I think we're all familiar with that we see in ourselves. So, there's a lot of behavior in this chapter, right? And so there's a lot of little details to focus on. I want to talk a little bit about Baddeley's model, and then the behaviors that he relates to the different aspects of this model. This is a model I really want you to pay close attention to, both from the behavioral side, and then when I come back and post a video on the brain, I'm going to relate these behaviors to where we think they are happening in the brain as well. So this is definitely something I want you to pay attention to. And again, right, there's more background to working memory that happens before this in the chapter, so definitely pay attention to that as well. But this is something I think it's worth spending a little bit of time talking through in this format. So we're talking about short-term memory versus long-term memory, right? You should have an idea of the differences between those. What Baddeley really proposed is that we should kind of think about short-term memory in a special way because of its active component, and so he's the one that really started to talk about working memory, right? And because people, kind of came through school at different times, we still see short-term memory and working memory used a lot, and often interchangeably. And this is kind of why. It's thanks to Baddeley. So working memory in his model is really kind of like the workspace that we have in our consciousness. It's pulling in the things that are happening to us moment to moment, collecting all of that sensory input that we get through our different senses. And it's also what activates important long-term memories to pull back into our consciousness, right? So working memory is both, right, selecting information in the moment that we're being exposed to for what we want to pay attention to, but it's also what we use to reactivate old pieces of information when we need them, right? So when you're sitting, taking an exam and reading a question, you're pulling that information that you learned back into your conscious awareness via working memory, right, to enable you to perform the task of taking that exam, right? That's part of what working memory does. And he also breaks it down into three pieces: the phonological loop, which is kind of like our inner voice; visual spatial sketchpad, which is kind of like the inner eye, our ability to visualize things in our conscious awareness; and then the central executive, which is paying attention and manipulating these pieces of information, right? So this is the simple model that he proposes, right? We have our central executive, right, that's constantly monitoring, updating, kind of rerouting and organizing information. And it can do this, right? We can maintain information via these two, what he calls maintenance buffers: our phonological loop and our visual spatial sketchpad, right? So phonological loop basically can store about 2 seconds worth of auditory information, right? So we've talked about digit span a little bit before, and they talk about it in this chapter. This is a nice example of that, right? So if you were told to learn this list of numbers, it was up there for 2 seconds, and then it went into a delay, and you had to try and remember it, right? The most common way that people try and remember that is to repeat the numbers in their head. And that's the phonological loop, right? When you rehearse information verbally in your mind to maintain it, that's the phonological loop buffer that's helping keep that in your conscious awareness. right? So rehearsal is really primarily directed at the phonological loop. That's something that we typically do verbally, right? So it can be like hearing things in your mind. We all have different capacities for this, right? We think that everybody has this to some um, level, right? But this is the most common way to try and maintain that type of information. Just like we talked about how you used to have to repeat a phone number to yourself before you could write it down, before we could just text people phone numbers to each other, right? But this is how we maintain that information, right? And there's limits on it, right? So depending on how complex the information is, you can have kind of more capacity or less capacity there. So a really common task, like we've talked about a lot this semester, is learning a list of words, right? If you had to use your working memory for that, we see a word length effect, right? There's less capacity to memorize lists of long words that have lots of syllables compared to single syllable words, right? And so when you kind of go through the second part of the homework for this unit, you'll go through a task that's a really nice example of that kind of effect in particular. So try and keep this information as you go to there, right? And there's also different behavioral differences that work into this as well. So for example, if you're somebody that naturally speaks faster, you can usually rehearse longer lists of words, right? So that natural capacity or trained capacity for speech speed can also help you in terms of performance on that type of working memory task. You can remember longer lists of words if you can speak faster, if you think about that 2-second kind of window that we're talking about. Visual Spatial Sketchpad, right, holds both visual and spatial information, right? Right there in the name. And that's what we kind of call the mind's eye. Also has a limited capacity, but it's completely separate from the phonological loop. So you could have a certain amount of information in your phonological loop, but separate from that, you have an ability to keep information in your sketchpad. So filling one doesn't necessarily limit your ability to keep information in the other. So that's interesting, right? And this is something, unlike the phonological loop, that's studied really well in animals, because we can test their visual and spatial awareness and memory in a way that we can't with verbal information. So let's look at an example for this. All right, so I know that you already have these slides, and so you may have looked at this, but try and follow through step by step this scenario that I'm going to give you here. So imagine a 4x4 grid, 16 squares, right? You can think of like a 4x4 grid from Excel, right? Now picture a 1 in the second column of the second row, right? Try and picture that in your mind. Now place a 2 to the right of the 1. In the square above the 2, put a 3. To the right of the 3, put a 4. Below the 4, put a 5. Below that, put a 6. And to the left of that, put a 7. Right? So what number is above the 7? Right? Try and answer that. Right? So if you said 2, right, or if you had a pretty close approximation of what this looks like in your mind, right, that's what you're using the Visual Spatial Sketchpad, right? You were creating this visual image in your mind, and in this case, it involved spatial information as you kind of mapped this out as well, right? So that's an example of kind of the type of information, right? Keeping things in space in your mind so that you can use that information to work through problems. Right, and like I mentioned, we can study this really well in animals as well. So a really common task that's used is called a delayed non-matching to sample task. So in this example, right, this is again a trained monkey like in all these experiments that we talk about, right? But here's the start of a trial. Monkey can move this object, and there's a little food reward under there for the monkey to eat. And the screen comes down, and then we put down 2 objects, right? So this delay can vary, and that's where we start to test kind of that working memory, right? Short-term memory effect. And so the monkey knows that after this delay, in order to get another reward, it has to pick the object that it hasn't already seen. So in this case, it's going to choose red in order to get that reward, right? So we're testing its ability to keep that visual information in its memory before it can get that second reward, right? Have to keep the visual memory of the object during this delay, right? So this, again, in terms of an animal study, is a function of the visual spatial sketchpad. The last component is the central executive, right? And this is the working part of working memory, really. It's monitoring and manipulating the loop and the sketchpad, right, in order to use the information that's being stored in those buffers to execute different tasks, right? So it's the cognitive control over our behavior, right? So this is really complex organization in response to the demands of our day-to-day life in our environment, right? Central executive is directing our attention, monitoring and manipulating the information coming into it so that we can do our day-to-day activities and solve more complex problems, right? So this is obviously a really important part of working memory, but it's also probably the least understood because of its complexity. Right. And so this is where I wanted to give you examples of the different types of tests that cognitive scientists use to explore the different types of behaviors that the central executive is involved in. Right. So this is a table that you saw in the book with the list of kind of key behaviors. Right. So it's responsible for controlling the updating of our short-term memory, right? What's in our buffers. And we can study this using the NBAC task, right? So there's an example of this here. Let's take a quick look. You should go and try these out for yourself as well. But the N in NBAC just means how many items previously you need to remember whether it's a match or not. So let's take a look here. And this is something where if you do this, you can make it easier or harder. So 2 back is the easiest one. I just have to say for each item that pops up, does this match the same thing I saw 2 items ago, right? So we can take a look at this. All right, first item's a boot, then a spoon. It's a fish, okay, that doesn't match. Ball, pencil, ball, okay, that was 2 back. Pencil, yep. Cat, no. Pencil, yes. Cat, spoon, cat, spoon, fish, right? See if I can get one wrong here. I'll just say that's wrong, okay, because that car wasn't there before, right? And so that's pretty easy. But if you keep trying this out, see, can I stop this or is it just gonna go? Right? So then you can make this go up, right? Everyone's pretty good at 2 back, 3 back is a little bit more challenging. But as you get to 4 back, you have to constantly be saying, did you see this image 4 images ago? And so when we talk about controlled updating, what that means is, right, we have to constantly update what are the 4 items that we're paying attention to. Each time a new image pops up, we have to kind of push out the one that was now 5 ago and bring in that new image to store in our buffer, right? So it's not like we're just keeping one set of information. We have to constantly update it in that task. So that's what it means by controlled updating. And NBAC is one way that we can measure that. So Tower of Hanoi, you did for the first part of homework for this unit, right? And that's all about goals and planning, right? Planning ahead and executing certain behaviors in a certain order, right? And the Stroop task is something like we talked about just briefly earlier today, right? Something that most students at this point have seen, right? And this is about paying attention to stimuli and response inhibition, right? So the Stroop task involves reading the color of the font of a word as opposed to the word itself, and all the words are typically color words, right? And why this is really hard is because once you learn how to read, it's really hard to inhibit reading, right? So if you're supposed to be saying that the word is yellow because the font color is yellow, but the word itself is red, you have to inhibit saying red because red is written in yellow color, right? So it's something that's hard. When it matches up, right, it's pretty easy, but when it's different like that example, it's really hard to inhibit the word itself, right? And so we're usually taking longer to respond on those what we would call incongruent trials, right? And if you haven't seen the Stroop task before, that's a really nice kind of simple link to an example of that study, and you can actually time yourself on the different conditions and measure your own Stroop effect. The other example I want to show you before we're done is the Wisconsin card sorting task, right? So you read about this in the book. This is all about task switching. So it's a really cool task where you have different possible rules that you can match your set of cards to. And once you learn the rule, you get to keep going with that. But then at some point in your experiment, the rule switches and you have to update and follow that new rule and stop following the old rule. So we can go through a little bit of this. I won't do the whole thing because I think it's something like 60 trials. Let's take a little bit of a look, right? So this is something, again, right, if you're interested and you want to kind of see what it looks like for yourself, you should definitely go do this, right? So in the task, you got to match a card to one of the 4 different cards at the top of the screen, right? So you have to find out if you're right or not. You get feedback if you're correct or not. And if not, you got to try a different rule, right? So here's an example, right? So we could match this card by color, in which case we'd pick this. We could match it by the shapes on the cards. In this case, we'd pick this, or we could match it by the number of objects, in which case we would match here, right? So there's different options that we can choose, and we get feedback on whether we're right or not, and that helps us on the next trial, right? So we have to decide what that rule is, but at some point the rule is going to change, and when that rule changes, that's really where we're interested in this case. How many errors is somebody making after a rule switches, right? So let's take a little bit of a look here. Here's our first trial. All right, so we got this card here. So let's match on number first and see if we're right there. Nope. Okay, so it's not number. So let's try shape. Okay, so that's right. So now we know it's matched on shape. So we can go through here, just keep matching on shape. Cruising along, no problems. Okay, so now that was wrong, so it's not shape, right? So now we got color and number as options. Let's go with number. Okay, so now it's number, right? So now we have to remember to do number as the new rule. Got to stick with number. It's not shape anymore. Number, see? Hesitated a little bit, started to go for shape. Did it again there, right? So it's a little bit slower, but I'm not making errors. So it's looking at reaction time and it's looking at errors. How can we make sure that we're able to do the right thing? Oh, number. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop that there, but you can get the idea. So these are really good examples of tasks. You definitely want to know the different behaviors of cognitive control as you work through this chapter. And again, what I want to bring into the next video is going to be a little bit about what's going on in the brain with a focus of where the different aspects of this model seem to be working at the level of the brain, right? So I think this chapter is a little tricky because it is a little bit intuitive, but it's also a lot of challenging detail. So please let me know if any of this stuff isn't making sense, right? Ask questions on the discussion board, send me an email, and we'll work through it. Otherwise, right, stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll talk to you all again soon.